What if a country had everything, resources, history, momentum, yet stopped progressing for an entire generation? This is the story of Brazil's invisible trap, decoded from one of the sharpest economic breakdowns you'll ever hear. In 2009, The Economist ran a cover story with the Christ the Redeemer statue launching off its pedestal like a rocket. The headline, Brazil Takes Off. The world's eighth largest economy was graduating. Goldman Sachs had already anointed it a brick, one of four nations destined to dominate the 21st century. By 2012, Brazil's GDP surpassed Britain's, the sixth largest economy on Earth. That was the peak. Today, Brazil's GDP per capita is lower than it was in 2012. Not stagnant, lower. 13 years of net zero progress for 215 million people. The standard explanation, corruption, bad leaders, commodity prices, misses something structural, something buried so deep in the architecture of the Brazilian economy that no election, no reform package, and no commodity boom has ever been able to dislodge it. And there is one mechanism in particular operating since the 1990s that has silently transferred more wealth out of productive Brazil than every corruption scandal in the country's history combined. We need to go back to when Brazil's future looked inevitable. Between 1968 and 1973, Brazil's economy expanded at an average annual rate of 11.2%. Industrial output grew at 12.6% per year. Steel production tripled. Car manufacturing quintupled. Coffee, which had once accounted for 42% of exports, dropped to under 13% as manufacturing surged to nearly 28% of the total. Economists called it the Brazilian miracle, and the name wasn't hyperbole. From 1900 to 1980, Brazil had one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Income per capita rose faster than in the United States. A rural agricultural colony had transformed itself into an urban industrial power in the span of 2 generations. President Juscelino Kubitschek had promised 50 years of progress in 5 in the 1950s, and the country delivered something close. Brasilia, an entire planned capital city built from scratch in the middle of the Cerrado, was inaugurated in 1960 as a symbol of a nation that was done waiting. Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer who fled to Brazil during World War II, titled his 1941 book Brazil, Land of the Future. Brazilians turned it into a joke that persists to this day. Brazil is the country of the future, and always will be. But in the 1970s, nobody was laughing. The future looked like it had already arrived. What killed it wasn't a single event. It was a sequence of structural traps, each one disguised as something else. Bad luck, temporary crisis, growing pains, and each one fed the next. The first trap is the one that looks most like a blessing. Brazil sits on roughly 12% of the world's fresh water. It holds the second largest iron ore reserves on the planet. It dominates 98% of the world's known niobium deposits. It is the largest global exporter of soybeans, sugar, orange juice, coffee, beef, and chicken. Crude oil from its pre-salt deepwater fields generated $44.8 billion in export revenue in 2024 alone, making petroleum the country's single most valuable export for the first time, overtaking soy. In total, commodities, soy, iron ore, oil, sugar, meat, account for roughly 60% of Brazil's merchandise exports. China alone absorbs 27% of everything Brazil sells internationally. And this is where the trap closes. Between 2003 and 2011, global commodity prices underwent their largest sustained surge in a generation. China's industrialization consumed iron ore, soybeans, and crude at a pace the world had never seen. Brazil was perfectly positioned. The real strengthened. Foreign reserves swelled. Government revenues climbed. The Lula administration used commodity windfalls to fund Bolsa Familia and other transfer programs that pulled over 30 million people out of poverty. The story was beautiful, and for nearly a decade it was true. But something else was happening underneath the headline numbers. While commodity revenues surged, Brazil's manufacturing sector was quietly being hollowed out. The strong real made Brazilian-made goods expensive on global markets, and cheap imports flooded in domestically. Manufacturing's share of GDP, which had been roughly 36% during the miracle years, fell through the 1990s and 2000s. By 2024, it sat at approximately 13.3%. That is deindustrialization on a scale comparable to what Britain experienced under Thatcher, except Britain had the City of London and the world's second largest financial services industry to partially absorb the shock. Brazil had soybeans. Economists call this Dutch disease. The term comes from the Netherlands in the 1960s, when the discovery of massive natural gas deposits in Groningen caused the Dutch guilder to appreciate, which crushed Dutch manufacturing exports. The resource boom destroyed the non-resource economy. Brazil ran the same playbook at continental scale. Here's the part that makes Dutch disease so vicious. When commodity prices are high, nobody notices the manufacturing decline because the GDP numbers still look strong. When commodity prices collapse, as they did in 2014 and 2015, the manufacturing base that might have cushioned the fall no longer exists. Brazil discovered this in real time. The economy contracted 3.5% in 2015 and another 3.3% in 2016, the worst recession in the country's recorded history. And the industrial capacity that had been the engine of the miracle era was not there to restart. The dependency deepened even as the warning signs flashed. By 2024, China absorbed 27% of Brazil's total exports. Iron ore alone, $29.85 billion worth, flowed predominantly to Chinese steel mills. When China's property sector began unwinding in 2021 and in 2022, iron ore prices whipsawed. Brazil's export revenues dipped even as volumes climbed. In 2025, iron ore exports hit a record 416 million tons, yet total revenue fell to $28.9 billion because prices had softened. More ore shipped, less money received. The treadmill sped up while the ground beneath it eroded. There is a deeper irony embedded here. During the commodity boom, Brazil's government used windfall revenues to fund social programs rather than building the industrial infrastructure that might have reduced commodity dependence. That was a defensible human choice, with millions lifted from poverty, child mortality dropping, school enrollment rising. But it was also the choice that locked the next generation into the same structural vulnerability. The programs created constituencies. The constituencies demanded continuation. The continuation demanded revenue, and the revenue still came from the same place it always had: the dirt under Brazilian soil and the beans growing on top of it. South Korea faced a resource-poor starting position in the 1960s and made a deliberate, painful choice: develop manufacturing depth, protect infant industries, invest brutally in education, and diversify exports up the value chain. By the 1990s, Korea was exporting semiconductors and automobiles. Brazil, blessed with the resources Korea lacked, never felt the same urgency to climb. Why manufacture complex electronics when the world will pay you handsomely to ship iron and soy? That question contained the answer to why Brazil never became a superpower. But the commodity trap alone doesn't explain what happened. Plenty of resource-rich nations have managed to build diversified economies alongside their extractive sectors: Norway, Canada, Australia. What made Brazil different was what the state did with the money. Brazil has a tax burden of approximately 32 to 34% of GDP, depending on whose methodology you trust. The National Treasury's 2024 figures show 32.3%. The Fundação Getulio Vargas, using a broader measure that includes parafiscal contributions, puts it above 34%. Either way, Brazil collects taxes at a rate comparable to OECD nations. France sits at 43.8%, Germany at rough 37%. The OECD average is 33.9%. Absorb that for a second. Brazil, with a GDP per capita of roughly $10,500, firmly middle income, taxes its economy at the same rate as countries with per capita incomes 3 to 5 times higher, and gets almost nothing for it. Among the 30 highest taxed countries in the world, Brazil ranks dead last in welfare return to its citizens. Last. The OECD reports that only 45% of Brazilians express satisfaction with the health system, compared to a 68% average in developed nations. Infrastructure investment, the roads, ports, rail lines, and digital networks that underpin productivity, has been starved for decades. Public investment fell below 0.7% of GDP in recent years, even as total government spending rose 68% in real terms between 2006 and 2017. Where did the money go? It went into a pension system that, until reforms in 2019, allowed public servants to retire in their early 50s with full salary replacement, in a country where average life expectancy had climbed to 76 years. Military pensions were even more generous. A Brazilian army colonel could retire after 30 years of service in his late 40s, collecting a pension indexed to inflation for potentially 3 decades. The pension deficit consumed resources that in peer nations flowed into bridges, fiber optic cables, and research universities. It went into a bloated civil service structured across federal, state, and municipal layers with overlapping mandates and minimal accountability. Brazil has 5,570 municipalities, each with its own mayor, council, and administrative apparatus, many of them governing populations smaller than a mid-size apartment complex. The overhead of governing Brazil is staggering, not because the country is corrupt, but because it is administratively fragmented in ways that make efficient resource allocation nearly impossible. It went into constitutionally mandated revenue transfers that guaranteed spending floors in education and health, regardless of whether the spending produced outcomes. Brazil spends a respectable share of GDP on education. Student performance on international assessments tells a different story. The PISA rankings have shown Brazilian students consistently performing below the OECD average in reading, mathematics, and science. The spending flows, the outcomes do not follow. It went into subsidized credit through BNDES, Brazil's massive state development bank, that channeled cheap loans to large politically connected firms, while small businesses paid market rates that made their eyes water. During the Dilma Rousseff administration, BNDES lending ballooned. The Treasury lent to BNDES at subsidized rates, and BNDES relented to corporations at below market rates. The fiscal cost of that spread, the difference between what the government paid to borrow and what BNDES charged its borrowers, was absorbed by the taxpayer quietly off the headline budget numbers. The Brazilian state became extraordinarily good at collecting money and distributing it. What it never became good at was converting that money into productive capacity. Roads remained unpaved. Brazil transports over 60% of its freight by road, yet only a fraction of its highway network is properly maintained. Ports remained congested, adding days and dollars to every container leaving Santos. Regulatory compliance, the famous Custo Brasil, the Brazil cost, required firms to spend an estimated 1,500 hours per year simply calculating and filing taxes. The OECD average hovers around 160 hours. By one World Bank estimate, the fiscal cost of policies designed to offset the government's own impediments to efficiency runs to nearly 5% of GDP. The state creates the obstacle, then spends public money to help firms partially get around it. Think about what that means for a factory owner in São Paulo trying to compete with a factory owner in Shenzhen. Before producing a single unit, before hiring a single worker, before shipping a single crate, the Brazilian firm is carrying a weight that its Chinese competitor does not even know exists. The tax code alone functions as an invisible tariff on domestic productivity. And this is before you factor in the cost of capital, which is where Brazil's trap turns from painful to almost sadistic. Stop for a moment. Everything you've heard so far, the commodity curse, the fiscal bloat, the regulatory weight, other countries have these problems too. Argentina has them. Indonesia has them. Mexico has them. Those countries struggle, but they don't have the same eerie quality of a nation that should be dominant and simply isn't. What separates Brazil from every other middle-income country with structural problems is this next mechanism, and it has been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. This is the part I mentioned at the top, the mechanism that has silently transferred more wealth out of productive Brazil than every corruption scandal in the country's history combined. As of early 2026, Brazil's benchmark interest rate sits at 14.75%. The central bank held it at 15% for 5 consecutive meetings through much of 2025 before cutting by 25 basis points. For context, the United States federal funds rate is in the 4 to 5% range. The European Central Bank's main rate is under 3%. Japan's is barely above zero. Brazil's Selic rate is one of the highest among major economies on Earth. And this is not an anomaly, it is the permanent condition. Since the real plan stabilized inflation in 1994, ending a hyperinflationary spiral that had hit 2,477% annually in 1993, Brazil's real interest rates have been among the highest in the world consistently. The Selic has averaged roughly 9.7% over the past decade. During the same period, the country's real GDP growth averaged 0.8% per year. Sit with those two numbers. The interest rate that the government pays on its own debt has been, on average, roughly 12 times the rate at which the economy has been growing. This creates a fiscal doom loop. Government gross debt reached 76.5% of GDP in 2024 and is projected to climb past 79% by 2028, according to World Bank estimates. But the composition of that debt is what matters. Nearly all of it, 97%, is denominated in reais, and much of it is indexed to the Selic rate itself. When the central bank raises rates to fight inflation, the government's own debt servicing costs explode simultaneously. Higher rates mean higher deficits. Higher deficits mean more borrowing. More borrowing at high rates means even higher debt service costs. The snake eats its own tail. In 2024, Brazil's general government primary fiscal deficit shrank to 0.3% of GDP, a genuine improvement. But the overall nominal deficit, which includes interest payments, remained enormous because the cost of servicing existing debt at 14 to 15% interest rates dwarfs whatever savings the primary balance produces. A professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro described it bluntly. Interest on the debt is a direct transfer of wealth from productive society to the financial sector. The richest segments of Brazilian society, those who hold government bonds, receive guaranteed inflation-adjusted returns that exceed what almost any productive enterprise in the country can generate. Why would you build a factory when you can lend money to the government at 15%? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the central question of the Brazilian economy, and it has been answered the same way for 30 years. Capital flows toward the guaranteed return. Manufacturing investment starves, productivity stagnates. And the fiscal pressure that caused the high rates in the first place never resolves because the economy never grows fast enough to outrun the debt. Consider the math facing a Brazilian entrepreneur in 2025. She wants to open a textile factory in Minas Gerais. Her cost of capital, the interest rate on a commercial loan, might be 25% or higher after bank spreads. Her expected return on invested capital in manufacturing might be 8 to 12% if everything goes well. She could instead buy government bonds yielding 15%, risk-free, inflation-adjusted, liquid, requiring 0 employees and 0 regulatory compliance. The rational choice destroys the productive choice every single day across every sector for 3 decades running. This is not a market failure. The market is functioning exactly as designed. The incentive structure simply makes production less attractive than lending to the government. Billions of reais that might have funded factories, equipment, research, and jobs instead sit in sovereign paper, earning guaranteed returns while the real economy limps forward at fractions of a percent. The Brazilian central bank is not incompetent. It faces a genuine dilemma. Inflation expectations in Brazil remain stubbornly above target, 4.1% projected for 2026 against a 3% target. The real depreciated 27.9% against the dollar in 2024 alone, reaching 6.19 reais to the dollar, which feeds imported inflation. If the central bank cuts rates too aggressively, inflation reignites and the currency slides further. If it holds rates high, the fiscal doom loop tightens. There is no clean exit. There hasn't been one since 1994. Now layer the final piece, because what makes Brazil's trap structurally different from, say, Germany's industrial decline or France's fiscal sclerosis is who pays the cost. Economists Lance Taylor and Edmar Basha coined a term in the 1970s that has aged with uncomfortable precision. They called Brazil Belindia, Belgium inside India. The top 20% of the population lived at Western European standards of consumption. The remaining 80% lived in conditions closer to South Asia. The miracle years hadn't lifted all boats. They had built a yacht club inside a fishing village. 50 years later, the structure persists. Brazil's income distribution remains among the most unequal in Latin America, itself the most unequal region on Earth. World Bank and IPEA data tell the same story from different angles. The bottom quintile saw real income growth of over 6% annually during the commodity boom of the 2000s, largely through direct government transfers, genuine progress. But the structural mechanisms, the high interest rates that reward capital holders, the regressive consumption taxes that fall hardest on the poor, The dividend tax exemption that allows top earners to pay effective rates comparable to middle-income workers remain fully operational. Brazil's tax system collects 56% of its revenue from consumption taxes, taxes on goods and services. For comparison, the OECD average is roughly 32%. Consumption taxes are inherently regressive. A minimum wage worker in Recife pays the same tax rate on rice and cooking gas as a billionaire in São Paulo. The Brazilian Institute of Planning and Taxation calculated that in 2024, Brazilians worked until May 28th just to pay their annual tax obligations. For the poorest Brazilians, that burden lands on food, fuel, and transport, the inescapable costs of survival. Meanwhile, dividends distributed by Brazilian corporations have been tax exempt since 1995. Research from the EU Tax Observatory published in 2025 showed that Brazil's wealthiest 0.01% often face effective tax rates comparable to middle-income earners once corporate structures and dividend exemptions are accounted for. The system taxes consumption at Scandinavian rates and taxes capital at Caribbean rates. The gap between those two facts is the architecture of Brazilian inequality. The 2024 Tax Reform Supplementary Law 214/2025 represents the most significant overhaul in decades. It replaces the labyrinth of overlapping consumption taxes with a dual VAT system that should, in theory, reduce compliance costs and improve efficiency. The IMF praised it as a potential boost to productivity and formal employment, but it does not fundamentally alter the capital versus consumption imbalance that defines who bears the weight. Here's where every strand connects, and once you see the connection, you cannot unsee it. The commodity wealth removed the urgency to industrialize. The absence of industrial depth made the economy volatile and dependent on global price cycles it couldn't control. The state, flushed with revenue during booms, expanded obligations that couldn't be sustained during busts. The resulting fiscal pressure forced interest rates to permanently elevated levels. Those rates rewarded financial capital over productive investment, which suppressed the industrial growth that might have diversified the economy away from commodities. And the entire cost structure fell disproportionately on the people least equipped to bear it, while those best positioned to invest in productive capacity had a guaranteed risk-free alternative sitting right there in the bond market. Each trap reinforces the others. Commodity dependence feeds fiscal fragility. Fiscal fragility feeds high interest rates. High interest rates feed deindustrialization. Deindustrialization feeds commodity dependence. The circle closes, and it has been running largely uninterrupted since the early 1980s. Brazil's output per worker has grown at approximately 0.7% per year since the mid-1990s. Total factor productivity, the measure of how efficiently an economy converts inputs into outputs, has been negative during some periods since 2010. Agricultural productivity is a genuine bright spot, rising well above global averages, but agriculture accounts for roughly 6% of GDP. It cannot pull a $2.3 trillion economy out of a structural trap by itself. The country that was supposed to be a superpower is not failing because its people are untalented or its leaders uniquely corrupt. It is trapped in a set of interlocking structural mechanisms that have proven remarkably resistant to political change. Left, right, military, civilian, technocrat, populist, the mechanisms predate any current government and will outlast them. They are architectural. They are the building itself, not the tenants. Consider what South Korea looked like in 1960. Poorer than Brazil on a per capita basis, fewer natural resources, smaller domestic market, devastated by war. Within 4 decades, Korea had built Samsung, Hyundai, POSCO, and an industrial base that exports $644 billion of goods annually. Korea's GDP per capita is now roughly $33,000. Brazil's is $10,500. In 1960, they were peers. And the difference was not intelligence or work ethic. It was that Korea, lacking commodities, had no alternative but to build industrial depth. And Brazil, blessed with everything, never faced that constraint. Wealth before wealth. The resources that looked like a head start were the weight that slowed the runner. Brazil's economy grew 2.3% in 2025. The central bank is expected to begin easing rates cautiously. The tax reform is being implemented. These are real, incremental positives. But the structural loop, commodities, fiscal bloat, interest rates, deindustrialization, inequality, has survived every reform cycle since 1985. It survived redemocratization. It survived hyperinflation. It survived the real plan. It survived the commodity boom. It survived impeachment, pandemic, and political crisis. The loop doesn't need any particular government to keep running. It runs on its own physics. Stefan Zweig wrote about Brazil's future in 1941. He killed himself in Petropolis the following year, despairing over the state of the world. His book remains the most famous prophecy about Brazil. It has been waiting to come true for 85 years. The question isn't whether Brazil has potential. Every serious economist who studies the country agrees the potential is staggering. The question is whether a system designed to circulate wealth between commodity extraction and government bond coupons while taxing consumption and starving investment can ever be broken from the inside by the people it was built to serve. History on that particular question has not yet delivered a verdict, but the pattern is not encouraging. The architect